We are less than 50 days away from the presidential election, and so much is in play that could affect the outcome, obviously. We'll break it all down for you here at 91.9 FM Public Affairs and APSU TV. We'll be speaking today with APSU Political Science Professor Emeritus Dr. David Kanervo. And David, thank you so much for joining us here. I'm Micca Terrell. Now let's start first with the Supreme Court. Obviously, the recent passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to, of course, affect severely what happens here. So let's talk first. Obviously, Republicans want to fast track a conservative successor to Justice Ginsburg. And to do a little history here, let's talk about just a few short years ago in 2016, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocked President Obama's efforts to have the seat of late Justice Antonin Scalia taken care of. And McConnell said that any appointment would have to wait after the election. So it was a really concern to not fast track things at that point. So things have obviously changed. And that was 10 months before the election at that time. So now the GOP wants to fast track a replacement for Justice Ginsburg when the election is less than 2 months away. And apparently McConnell has even said the GOP would confirm Trump's choice even before a possible successor was named or subjected to confirmation hearings, which is rather surprising. So what political ramifications do you think this will have on the GOP if the Senate rushes things in order to fill Justice Ginsburg's seat?
Well, of course, one of the impacts will be the quality of the justice and whether there are any questions about her. And Trump did say he was going to nominate a woman. So the questions about whether she has any skeleton, so to speak, in her closet that might lead to some controversy during the hearings. I'm bothered, I guess, personally a little bit by the hypocrisy that is evident from the fact that 4 years ago, when the situation was somewhat similar, it wasn't completely similar because, of course, they had a Democratic president and a Republican Senate back when Obama nominated his candidate. So the difference is that this is a matter of raw politics and raw political power, of Republicans being in control this time of the presidency and the Senate. Now, what it will do, I think, is to steal those who are Biden voters, who are Democrats, into believing that this election is much more important, perhaps, than they thought it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. The hope, of course, was that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would last until a Democrat became president and could appoint a Democratic successor. Of course, this didn't happen. And so it's a matter of the Democratic voters, I think, being more angry than they might have been and more determined, perhaps, to give payback to the Republicans by making sure they registered, making sure they get out to vote and vote for Biden and Harris. Republicans, on the other hand, I think feel very good about this, obviously. Now they have a chance to produce a real 6-3 majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court. This is something that they had hoped for. Trump, I think, sees it as a way of solidifying his legacy. One of the things which I'm sure he is concerned about is if he loses, what kind of impact will he have had on the country overall? And this will be a way of providing a legacy for himself that will be lasting for quite some time. After all, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and presumably the woman that he appoints are young enough that they will be on the court for the next perhaps 20, 30, 40 years. So this is something which I'm sure that both parties are upset about. The Democrats livid because of what the Republicans are doing, but the Republicans very joyous about what opportunity fell into their lap.
Yeah, it seems like they are so excited that they may not be necessarily paying attention to, well, at least some of the nominees. And I know that none officially have been named yet, but I know you and I have both been doing research, and you mentioned skeletons in the closet. I know of at least one woman who is a former law professor at Notre Dame University, who their concerns about her religious standing. She's apparently an avid Catholic, which is again, religious freedom is part of America's foundations. But again, it may be a concern that these, I guess, the backgrounds of these candidates may not necessarily be vetted enough.
Well, of course, we've had Catholics on the court for almost 100 years, and so this would be nothing new, except that, of course, with the question of abortion and choice versus the pro-life stance, means that someone who is a very avid Catholic might be more fervent in her belief, and might be someone who would be an absolute vote for the pro-life position and a vote to override Roe versus Wade. At the same time, though, Biden is himself a Catholic, someone for whom faith is very important, and yet he has taken, of course, a pro-choice stance, somewhat to the dismay of some of his fellow Catholics, but nevertheless, being Catholic doesn't necessarily mean 100% what a person's stance will be on Roe versus Wade and abortion.
Right, and obviously, again, it being a choice is key part of that. How do you think that this Supreme Court, I guess it's sort of a tug of war kind of situation, how much do you think that will, I know you touched lightly on how it will affect probably turnout in the actual election, but let's talk a little bit about the debates, because those are starting soon as well. September 29th, not very far off. We have the first of the debates in Cleveland, Ohio. How do you think it will generate more interest or other things, or what are your thoughts so far?
Well, I think this particular issue, along with some others like the COVID virus, will provide a great deal of interest in the debates, and I would expect a very large viewing audience for the debates, particularly the first one, but certainly for the others as well.
Definitely. Now let's move on a little bit more to the election process. We've heard President Trump very recently speaking about the criticism of the upcoming election, where he says, like, I'm not going to step aside. I'm going to contest it. He's like, I don't like mail-in votes. Now he's suggesting there won't be a peaceful transition, and has basically said, when reporters have asked him repeatedly, will you accept it? He says he's basically kind of leaving it open. Meanwhile, Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator McConnell both have said it will be peaceful. What are your thoughts on this, and what effect would this have on our constitutional foundations of our country?
Well, I think Trump's statement that he is not assuring us that he would leave peacefully once his term is over is very distressing. It seems to me that one of the hallmarks of a democracy is the peaceful transition of power from one president or prime minister to another, and one party to another. And so for Trump probably to be the first president in our history to question the election outcomes as he has, and to not assure that he would abide by them, and that there would be a peaceful transfer of power, is very upsetting to those of us who believe very strongly in democracy and all the hallmarks of democracy, including a peaceful transfer of power. And what that might mean down the road, we don't know. Is it going to mean literally that Trump might call on his right-wing militia friends to come out into the streets with their guns to try to preserve his presidency? Does it mean that he would simply ignore the Supreme Court or any court rulings that might lead to a decision that he has lost the election fair and square and that he needs to vacate the office? We really don't know what he has in mind. It may very well mean that he simply is going to challenge the election results in court and let the chips fall where they may as a result of the court decision. Certainly he's hinted at that when he talked the other night about the importance of having a ninth member on the Supreme Court, because he believes that the election may very well go to court. One way, of course, of stopping that, or at least not leaving any real questions, is for there to be a lopsided victory. I don't know that that's going to happen in either direction, but that's also a possibility. So that all of this might very well be just talk that really comes to no fruition.
Yeah, obviously President Trump, I know he's very busily probably tweeting about this as we speak, and it could just be, again, just him busy stirring the pot, if you will, because he tends to do really, really well at that. Speaking of the pot being stirred, racial tension, some accuse of President Trump of doing that by some of the comments he's made about the recent case with Breonna Taylor, the young woman in Kentucky who was shot and died at her apartment, and the recent grand jury action, which basically one officer, a former officer, was charged with wanton endangerment. So no officers have been charged in her death. So obviously that case, George Floyd's case, Tamir Rice, the many other names that have been brought forward as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, we obviously that's a sort of a diametric opposite to President Trump, who says, there's not a need for this, there needs to be law and order, but he, as far as racial tension goes, he doesn't seem to see it as an issue that the Democrats do. So how do you think, let's talk about that and how that obviously affects what could be happening in the election too?
I think one of the impacts of the Breonna Taylor case, but also the other shootings such as the Floyd death, he was not shot, but he was nevertheless killed by a police officer. Those sorts of deaths that have occurred in the Black community are ones that I think will stimulate more Black voters to go to the polling places. It seems to me that despite Trump's attempt during the Republican campaign to show that he has done a lot for African Americans and that they should support him, that more likely than not, large Black turnout should help the Biden-Harris campaign. And so this may be a way of trying to get more people to vote. I think Trump's kind of blowing off the Taylor shooting is a way of trying to just simply move on, not concentrate on it, so that people don't think about it a lot. Obviously, in the African American community, people are thinking about it, they're acting on it, and it could very well spell a problem for his campaign. A lot of the determination, of course, of who's going to win is going to be which people choose to vote and which ones don't. And we know that Trump's people are, for the most part, very energized and motivated to vote. And it's a matter then of making sure that Biden's folks are equally, if not more so, motivated to turn out and vote. In some cases, they may take more motivation. And the Taylor case and the other shootings of African Americans is a way of getting them motivated. But the last election, 2016, was won by a very, very small margin of votes. The less than 100,000 votes led to Trump winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the three states that put him over the top in the Electoral College. And so it's not going to take much of a turnaround in the voter turnout and the decision to vote in those states to make the election go against Trump and for Biden-Harris.
Right, and if you're just tuning in, joining us here at 91.9 FM, APSU TV, we're speaking with Dr. David Kanervo, APSU Political Science Professor Emeritus, about the countdown. We're getting close. We're less than 50 days away from the presidential election, and again, a lot of things in play. We've discussed racial tension. We've discussed the Supreme Court successor situation, and also the chance that President Trump says, hey, I may not step aside. So continuing on that vein of thought, Dr. Kanervo, you discussed how President Trump tries to kind of push things to the side and just move forward. Speaking with COVID-19, obviously the pandemic is still ongoing, still a big concern, a huge topic, obviously, because we have on one side President Trump saying at the very beginning, oh, you know, this is a concern. We're going to close down things with China. We're not going to let people travel. But from there, it was like he has not been a huge endorser of masks. He's like, oh, wear them, but hasn't been a huge supporter. His rallies recently held, he's not worn one. His supporters haven't worn one. He has also openly said that he's, we'll get over it and everything. But then on the other side, we have people who are with the CDC who have had direct conflict with what some of his things have said. Dr. Anthony Fauci, for instance, Dr. Deborah Birx have, maybe Dr. Deborah Birx not quite so much outspoken as Dr. Fauci, but they have, again, conflicted with him over his preference to say, necessarily the science isn't always the big thing. And he's even endorsed, injecting disinfectants and other kind of unscientific things, if you will. How do you think his handling of this pandemic, putting out misinformation, his attitudes toward masks, how do you think that's going to affect what's happening with his campaign and, of course, ultimately the election?
Of course, the fact that he has downplayed it purposely, as he told Bob Woodward in their interviews, is a tactic which he has used to try to serve himself and to keep people from becoming angry over the large number of deaths. We lead the world in deaths due to COVID-19. And certainly I would think that many of those families, as we saw during the Democratic convention, are going to blame Trump for that, because he did downplay it. He did not say that people should wear masks or that they should necessarily socially distance, that they should be too concerned about it, that it would just go away on its own. And so the result is that we have the deaths. We have a lot of people who are quite angry because of the needless deaths. Now, we knew that with the COVID-19 here, that there were going to be some deaths. Question is, what percentage of that 202,000 that had died might be considered needless or collateral damage, as opposed to the perhaps much smaller fraction that would have died anyway, regardless of what was done and who was president. So Trump, I think, is facing some real pushback to the pandemic and the problems that it has brought to this country. We have high unemployment because of it. A number of businesses have failed because of it. And so Trump has a lot that people can blame him for. Question is whether they will or not. Again, I would argue that those who are primarily his supporters, those who are really Trump Republicans, and not all Republicans are Trump Republicans, but those who are Trump Republicans would nevertheless vote for him and say that he did the best he could under the circumstances. Others, of course, are going to blame him and that will affect their voting as well.
Right. And along that same line of thought, the whole vaccine situation, because I think that's a whole another, I guess, part of this COVID situation. And we'll touch on the economy in just a moment. But obviously, just recently, the past few days, there's been a huge development with Johnson & Johnson saying, hey, we've come up with a one-shot vaccine that might work. And President Trump tweeted, said, get on it, get it done as quickly as possible. Yet some are worried that this is being railroaded through and that the safety concerns are not being taken as seriously. In fact, just recently, New York State said, we will conduct our own testing on this vaccine. We are concerned it is not going to be safe enough for people. And obviously, such a vaccine would be very important. But again, it's all connected to the situation where the CDC's information has been taken down from its website, manipulated by officials from the Health and Human Services Administration. And so there's a lot of infighting within this government agency. How do you think that speaks to what is happening in general in the government since President Trump has taken over and obviously may be taking and continuing?
Of course, we know that there are some people who are hesitant to take vaccines anyway. That's been a real problem with the children being vaccinated for the common childhood diseases, mumps, measles, and so on. And this is going to simply give those what we call anti-vaxxers more evidence that perhaps vaccines are not so safe, that perhaps they're not carefully made, and that there ought to be some real hesitancy in taking it. The fact that the scientists and Trump have disagreed so much over the last 6 months is a real problem. It shows that Trump is not necessarily someone who believes in science, who believes in the scientific method and how things are to be tested and developed, and that perhaps, as was true with the hydrochloroquine, that he thinks he knows so much himself about everything that he can suggest things like a vaccine. He can declare that it is safe and usable when in fact it may not be. And so there's some real skepticism, I think, which he has created himself about the treatments for the coronavirus, for the vaccines that are being developed, and how safe they're going to be. And that also is a very sad situation, because it means that this pandemic might last longer because people are hesitant to go and get the vaccine once it has been approved by the CDC and the other scientific community. The fact that New York believes that they have to test it and verify it themselves rather than rely on what they are afraid is a political situation in the federal level regarding the vaccine production is in itself sad, that we feel we can't trust the people who are at the highest levels of medicine in this country. So again, this is a situation which Trump has brought on himself through his loose lips, so to speak. It seems to me that Trump, throughout his presidency, has not understood the impact that his words have on people's thinking in terms of their confidence, in regard to their willingness to believe what is happening in the world.
Definitely, and it's unfortunate that such a human health emergency has gotten politicized so much, and is to the detriment, obviously, of so many thousands and millions of people. And of course, the many others who have, as we mentioned, have suffered losing their jobs. Let's briefly talk about the economy. Congress is set to leave Washington very soon without approving a second stimulus package for the, again, many unemployed, the many small businesses who are shutting down people who are obviously need that sort of boost to help out. How will this economic sluggishness affect the election?
Well, of course, the general rule has been that it's the economy stupid, going back to Clinton, but even before Clinton, people have tended to vote primarily on their pocketbooks. And when the economy is doing well, people feel good about life and their situation, and they reward the president with re-election. When things are going very poorly, then they tend to vote against the incumbent and vote for the other party. And so that's the situation that Trump is facing. Had the pandemic not come, he would have stood a much better chance at re-election. But with the economy in the terrible situation that it is, it's going to mean that a lot of people are very unhappy. We know from the news reports that a lot of folks have not gotten their unemployment checks, that a lot of businesses have closed, many of them permanently. That unemployment, when it was down to 3.5%, 4%, has now moved up to 8.5%. So there's a lot of hurt in this country as a result of the pandemic and the economy, and particularly small businesses, family-owned businesses. If we look at the hospitality area of the economy, restaurants, particularly family restaurants, have not done well. Certainly hotels have not done well. Visitor sites have not done well. Music venues have not done well. And so there are a lot of segments of the economy that are hurting very badly right now. I think it's probably fair to say that there's no segment which is doing extremely well, except maybe hospitals and doctors' offices, and they may not be doing as well either because people are afraid that if they do go see a doctor or go to a hospital for a non-COVID related illness, that they may catch it and, of course, potentially die. So there are all sorts of reasons why people are afraid of what's happening in the economy, are negative about it, and may very well take it out on Trump on Election Day.
Right, and they very well may, depending, again, polls, as we've talked before when we had 2016 happen, remember, Dr. Kanervo, that polls are only as good as the samples on which they are based. So we know that obviously we'll just really have to come down to that actual day, right? We'll have to, I guess, encourage everybody to be active, right, to get out and get registered to vote, to please go to vote. Remember, October 5th is that deadline to register. Make sure everyone get out and vote and make your voice be heard and everything. Obviously, our young people here on campus, we know that that tends to be some of the ones that don't necessarily turn out. So we'd like to encourage them to obviously please register and make sure you cast your ballot.
Well, that's particularly important. College students are traditionally among the lowest turnout category of demographics. And so we need to be sure that young people vote because really they have more at stake than the rest of us. I'm beyond my career, and so it's a matter of young people who have careers awaiting them, who have for them 30, 40, 50, 70 years ahead of them in their lives, and the decisions that they make at this point politically are very important ones. If you think about the vision that Joe Biden has offered and the vision that Trump has offered, and I'm not taking a position that they should vote one way or another, but they need to think about the options that are presented to them and think about which option they like, what option they believe in, and take a stand about what's going to be best for them and their families and their community and their careers.
Definitely. And Dr. Kanervo, thank you so much for spending time with us here on WAPX-FM 91.9 FM and APSU TV. Again, everyone, Dr. David Kanervo, APSU Political Science Professor Emeritus. Here, thank you again. And I'm Micca Terrell for 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU TV.